All right, Gina Birkemeir is a licensed professional counselor and also the author of a book called Generations Deep: Unmasking Inherited Dysfunction and Trauma to Rewrite Our Stories Through Faith and Therapy. And Gina, I'm really glad to have you with me today. So thank you for being here. I appreciate just what you do and your book. And yeah, so thank you for being here.
Thank you for asking me. It's a privilege to get to do this kind of stuff. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, thank you. You know, as we were talking earlier, a lot of people have an understanding of trauma and what that looks like and where it comes from. And, obviously it can come from childhood abuse or life experiences or combat or work related or accidents or crime. There's so many uh, ways that a person can be traumatized, unfortunately, in this world. And I think oftentimes people don't know that there's also such thing as inherited trauma. And love just to hear from you, your experience, your as a counselor, your research, your expertise, and all that you know about inherited trauma, and just the impact that inherited trauma has on individuals.
Yeah, definitely. So it's interesting when we talk about inherited trauma, even within that, there's kind of some subsets and categories of inherited trauma. And there's some fascinating research out there that people can go and take a look at. Some of it has to do with, there's some things done on Holocaust survivors, there's some things done on the Dutch hunger winter. If you look up generational trauma and the Dutch hunger winter, and even as early as what happened in the towers in New York, we can take a look at that as well. All of those are some markers that we can look at for some generational trauma that happen in light of epigenetic changes from one generation to the next, not your genetics, but your epigenetics.
So
So,
explain
yes,
epigenetics real quick.
yeah. So your genetics is kind of your DNA, right? That's sort of what makes us up cellularly who we are. And then if you think about the sort of we've all seen that DNA chain, right? We've seen the illustrations of it. But imagine like something over and around it, almost like haloing the entire thing. Epi meaning above. So that would be your epigenetics.
Mm-hmm.
And so that think you could think of those as sort of switches that can turn certain genes off and on.
Mm-hmm.
And when we talk about generational trauma or inherited trauma, this is a place where we see this transgenerational epigenetic inheritance coming through. So that's one way that it happens when you have these things that happen because the generation before you went through something, and now it's kind of manifesting in your life in ways it just doesn't quite, you don't understand. Like you haven't had the personal experience of the thing, but you have this trauma response to certain things.
Yeah,
Okay. And you're
which is
trying to
really
understand.
really fascinating. I mean, the
Yes.
fact that someone a generation or two before you can experience this thing, and you can experience the impact of that thing years later.
Yeah. And we could go straight to the interesting research behind it, which I talk about this a little bit in my book. And so there was a study done on mice at Emory, and they used the scent of cherry blossoms to condition mice. And effectively, they first were introduced to the cherry blossom, very neutral, no problem. Then they started pairing it with a negative stimuli. So it was a small shock, but it was very uncomfortable. And so once they took that shock away, because it had been paired with the scent of the cherry blossom, the mice still had that same trauma response to the cherry blossom, even without that negative stimuli. Now, when those pups were bred and they then had babies, and those babies were introduced to the smell of the cherry blossom with no stimuli paired, they still had that negative trauma response because they epigenetically inherited that from the generation before them. What's fascinating to me is I feel that this is a place where scripture informs science, because in scripture we are told that the sins of the father are passed from to the third and the fourth generation, right? We see that repeated a few times in the Old Testament. And I used to really have a problem with that verse because it felt to me like, well, what is that? Like God's cracking some omniscient whip that's going to hit the third and fourth generation out. That doesn't seem really fair, right?
Yeah.
And then learning through my education, through my faith journey, through my healing journey from trauma myself, what I learned is that's really a plea from a benevolent God that says if we don't get our stuff together, the generations after us will suffer. And what's interesting about the science is what it shows us is that if there's nothing is interfered with and you just let that naturally breed out that negative response to the cherry blossom, it takes to the third or fourth generation for it to actually breed itself out with no intervention.
Yeah.
However, Dr. Isabel Mansway at the University of Zurich in Switzerland, her epigenetic team wanted to see if this is something that could go both ways. So if you had this mouse that was conditionally responding to the negative thing that wasn't even there anymore, could you then nurture that out effectively? Could you heal that out? And what they were able to prove is that you can do that. You can heal that out, and then the next generation doesn't have it.
Wow.
Now, that's a beautiful thing, but if anybody's listening to this who already has the kids and has already suffered the trauma and is already wondering what has been passed down, what we know is that healing is not just for that one time. And so even if kiddos are here, there's still healing that can be done for you that you can pass on to your kids in other ways, because our epigenetics have influencers all around us. And those influencers are our relationships, our environment, what we consume. And I don't mean just food, but what we consume through media, what we consume through our relationships, what we consume spiritually. All of those things impact our epigenetics and have the power to influence what sort of genes are turned off and on. So we can even say with this inherited trauma or inherited dysfunction or inherited patterns, we also can see things like, it's very common for us to say, oh, well, grandpa was an alcoholic, and then grandma was an alcoholic, and then dad was an alcoholic, because it went down the generations in the family, right? However, sometimes it manifests differently, but it's the same trauma roots. So maybe great grandpa had something happen to him and he dealt with it by numbing. And so then that's what grandpa learned. He watched his dad do. But his form of numbing came in people pleasing or overworking or in relationships, toxic relationships. So there's a lot of different ways that these things can pass from one generation to the next, and a lot of different ways they can manifest from one generation to the next as well.
Yeah. Wow. Golly. So interesting. And so in the same way, trauma can be passed down, healing can be passed down.
Yeah.
So like can be ripple effects of trauma for generations, and whether that's through modeling behaviors or through the genetics, but in the same way, someone who experiences healing from trauma can change that for generations as well.
Absolutely. It's that whole ripple effect. So kind of a tagline that has followed my book along is either we pass on our healing or we pass on our hurting. And that's just true. It's just true. And it's another place for me, Bo, where I just see the love of God showing up, because we don't have a trauma box in our brain, a place where we can just neatly store it away, which tells me that we were never created for the trauma in the first place.
That's right. Yeah.
But what's beautiful and fascinating is that our brain is created for the healing. It is wired for the healing, for the change, for the growth. That plasticity and that neurogenesis will follow us throughout the entire life cycle. And so we do have an opportunity to write a new narrative for ourselves and then to pass that narrative on.
Yeah. So cool. Wow. Gosh, that's amazing. And so you not only understand this clinically, but personally as well. You've got experience, right?
Yes. So the story I tell in the book is both my personal and professional journey. And it starts with my family going back to my great grandparents. And it begins with my great grandfather immigrating over from Italy, and kind of the story of that. And then how he meets my great grandmother and the trauma she had already experienced before he ever met her. And then how that manifested from one generation to the next, with little tweaks here and there, but the root was the same. It's like one of those banyan trees where it looks like you see all these trees growing, then you get up close and you realize that's all coming out of the same root. All those little trees are coming out of the same root. Kind of the same thing in my family. And it began to manifest in my own life as well. Some of the things that I experienced, I didn't quite understand that they were a manifestation of what had happened in the generations before me. Some of them were pretty clear. but that didn't mean I knew how to do anything about it.
Right.
Right. And so I think some of those things set us up, some of those traumas that we inherit set us up for additional traumas.
Mhm.
They sort of condition us a little bit to be more susceptible to other things happening to us. And that was true in my life. And so it really came to this point where I had a literal come to Jesus moment. I was raised sort of in and out of church. I was raised with a very big fear of God, not a whole lot of love about God's love or his mercy and grace. And so I was sort of in and out with faith. There's a line in the book where I say, it's not that I ever didn't believe in Jesus. I was just pretty sure God didn't believe in me. And so I was like, what's the point? Right? Like, you can't please him no matter what you do, just go live your life. And which is what I was doing. And it really was not working out for me. And so I had a literal come to Jesus moment where I was, and full disclosure, not fully sober, but I was on my knees on a bed, because I was in a toxic relationship and it was crumbling, which, I mean, you hear this now and you're like, praise Jesus that it was crumbling. But in the moment, it was like, no, what do I do? How do I hold on to this? And so on my knees, shaking my fist at God and said, either you kill me or you take over my life, because I can't do this anymore. Wow. And the next morning I woke up and thought about what I prayed and tried to backpedal the whole thing. Like, don't kill me and don't take over my life. Right.
Yeah.
But in his mercy, he did not let me take it back. And so things really started to crumble around me, and he kind of hemmed me into a place where I had no choice but to really look at my story, to ask for help, because I was literally homeless with kids, to look at my own story, to let people into the journey, and to figure out how in the heck am I going to do something different so my kids don't experience what I have experienced in my own life.
Yeah, so you are a living example that there's hope for healing. I mean, you generationally, there was trauma, and you inherited that, which led you to your own trauma. So, and then and now you're an example of healing from that. But so you said that sometimes by having generational trauma, it makes you more susceptible to kind of experiences or having your own trauma. Say a little more about that.
So there's a couple things that come to mind, and the word, you can put it under the umbrella of pre-existing vulnerabilities. And some of those have to do with things like alcoholism or substance abuse, where you have those pre-existing vulnerabilities. But there's in the book, there's a chapter called A Science Break, and we break down the epigenetics, and we break down what that means to have that pre-existing vulnerability of the generational trauma, and how that can open you up to your own problems. And I use the example of critical windows of development. If you have that generational pattern of alcoholism, substance abuse, whatever that might be, particularly if you're in a critical window of development and you're experiencing chaos in the home, you're experiencing some sort of trauma, whatever that might be, and you're then exposed to substance abuse yourself, you have far greater likelihood of that epigenetically turning that gene on. And then you are more predisposed to that manifesting in other types. If you start with alcohol, then it could be drugs, and then it could be more things. It's just that addictive bent that you might have.
Yeah.
And then the other side of it that I will say, I think kind of sets us up, is if you have a history in the family, it's more of a pattern of dysfunction that has been inherited, where maybe you're taught that obedience goes above and beyond everything. And so you just kind of walk around in the world saying yes to anyone that you fear will reject you if you say no, because maybe love has been withheld, right? Maybe if you don't obey, then you're not loved. And so you learn that you don't say no. So in critical windows of development, that is something that also sets us up. Like, for me, that set me up for molestation. That set me up for sexual abuse, because I didn't know that it was okay to say no and have agency over myself. Yep. And I didn't realize that it was okay to lose those relationships of people who threatened to emotionally harm me if I didn't do what they asked me to do.
Yeah.
So I think that those things can set us up for more problems moving forward, for more trauma. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. There's just in thinking of that, there's, I believe very much that our value is in who we are, not what we do. And in situations like that, you can begin to believe early on that your value comes from what you do, instead of who you are. And that can lead to some problems, because then in order to be valuable, I have to continue doing whatever I'm asked to do for whomever is asking. And people pleasing can get you in real danger, but it also can just set you up for, not great relationships or way to navigate life, really.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow. So, yeah. So it's easy then to see that because not only of genetics and generational trauma, but how you see things modeled for you. Felt safety is so important in general, especially when it comes to healing. But a child's only sense of safety and stability is their home and their parents. And when that's not being, when that doesn't feel safe and stable, that living in that fear or that instability can lead a child, a young person, to learn like there are ways to self-medicate, I guess, and then that can advance through the years into, like you said, drugs and alcohol, or
Absolutely.
even things that seem maybe look better, like being a workaholic. I'll work all the time, but still it's self-medication and things like that. So
that's really true. And I think part of that is the self-medicating that comes from, where do I get my soothing? Where do I get my sense of safety? Or just, I don't want to feel anything because I don't know how to feel. I don't know how to handle the emotions. So I will turn to something that numbs them or helps me ignore them or whatever. But I also think that what happens, which was true in my story, and I've seen this in a lot of my clients, is that when that is their experience as a kid, they're not getting that safety, that co-regulation, that secure attachment. They have no choice but to keep trying. Okay. As kids, they have no choice but to keep trying. And so they then turn it in on themselves. There's something wrong with me. I'm the problem. And on top of that, then you begin to resent and hate yourself for having needs. Because if you didn't have the need, your little brain tells you, if I don't have the need, then I don't have to go to this person who keeps hurting me and rejecting. And then that sets you up for a whole other gambit of problems moving in the future. Yeah.
And it's really amazing too, the core beliefs, the foundational beliefs that we end up developing through childhood for one reason or other. I'm a bad person. I'm worthless. I'm unlovable. I'm all these things because we're living in an environment with people who have been traumatized, and they're not able to give us what we need and to attach the way we need, and we begin to believe all these things about ourselves. And then that's another way that generational trauma continues, because now I feel these things about myself. That's going to have a direct impact on how I live my life and my relationships and how I view the world around me. And then if I'm raising kids out of that, like, it's just,
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's interesting. So I run Generation Steep groups that are based on the book. And we talk a lot about being triggered by our kids. And so if for whoever's listening, if you're trying to figure out the places where you might need some healing, look for the places where your kids trigger you, because no one can trigger us like our kids. Really. I believe no one can trigger us like our kids. But I think if we can look at it through the lens of, this is information that tells me where I need to go on my healing journey, God is trying to point me towards something, right? I think that can be helpful in just maybe reframing that, rather than getting all caught up in the shame of, I'm a terrible parent, I can't get this right, I'm doing the same thing my parents did to me, and then you just shut down and you shut your kid out. Right? That shame will never drive the connection that both of you are longing for. So to be able to really look at, where am I being triggered? And then look at that as the place, okay, take this information to somebody who can help me process through that.
And it can be such a different perspective on life. If you're going through, from week to week, and between counseling sessions or something. If you're going through and you're intentional to pay attention to, like you said, those things that are triggering you, instead of feeling like I'm bad or I'm broken or there's something wrong with me. Yeah, just saying, hey, these are little hints, like these are indicators of where I've been hurt, and what's being kind of like poking that wound and making me feel something, and then paying attention to that so that then you can have some direction in healing. And I think, it's important. I believe that when we are involved with someone whose behavior may not be ideal or whatever, kind of a quick reaction response is like, what's wrong with you? And to see that person instead of saying what's wrong with you, kind of wonder what happened to you,
Yes.
that has you acting this way and behaving this way. It's not that you're a bad person, it's that you're injured. And I think that having that same perspective for yourself, instead of saying what's wrong with me, like I can't get it right, what's wrong with me, if you can have some just a bit of grace and for yourself, and say, hey, maybe not ask what's wrong with me, but what happened to me, like what happened to me that's causing this thing to be a trigger for me and to cause this kind of feeling, this pain.
I love that so much. I have found myself saying that same thing, and I love it so much because that whole idea of recognizing that if you're coming at yourself with that voice, it's probably not really your voice. It's something that you've adopted from what you've heard
Yep.
other people say to you and
Yep.
in your more formative years, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm really glad you brought that up because that internal language is so important to the journey. Again, taking it back to shame. As soon as I say, what's wrong with you?
Mm-hmm.
I heard that growing up all the time with the littlest thing that I would do. I was just a kid trying to learn.
Mm-hmm.
But anytime there was a misstep, it was, what's wrong with you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. And so I adapted that voice as my own for a long time.
Sure.
And it would just shut me down and drive me farther into numbing behaviors and toxic behaviors and all of those things. So I think that's really important to pay attention to how we're talking to ourselves.
Yeah. Well, and that's something I like to say is it's better to talk to yourself than to listen to yourself,
I like that.
Because if we listen to ourselves, there's all these voices in our head from our entire life, and things that we heard. So it's so much easier to hold on to the negative stuff that we've heard about ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Positive things, we don't necessarily oftentimes don't live out of and hold on to all the positive things people have said, but it's the negative things that just bounce through our head all the time. And when we listen to those voices, that's going to continue to tell you that you're worthless and unlovable and there's something wrong with you and you're bad and whatever. But when you talk to yourself, I think it's important to speak good, positive truth to yourself about yourself, and truth, like I'm not going to say, hey, Bo, you're an NBA basketball star. Like, nope, that's not ever going to happen. So that's not truth. But if I can speak some good, positive truth about myself to myself, that can help to override those voices that you're listening to all the time. And I think it's really important. It's better to talk to yourself than to listen to yourself.
I love that. That's so good. I agree. Yes. So in the book, I talk about the story you tell yourself becomes most true.
Mm.
And so, and that's actually neuroscience, because what we rehearse, we reinforce.
Mm-hmm.
And so just thinking about those synapses, those neural pathways, those networks, they're going to be dedicated to something. They're going to create themselves based on a lie if you don't take hold of them and help them create themselves based on the truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so good. Wonderful. So what would you say? Obviously you believe that there is hope for healing. You've experienced it yourself. If someone is watching this and for the first time they may start thinking, hey, all these questions I've had about myself and not understanding certain ways that I am, and ways that I behave and ways that I feel about the world and myself. And like, to someone who feels that and sees this and says, maybe there's something to this inherited trauma for me, like, what would you say to someone who is watching this, who wonders if there's hope for healing for them and what that could look like?
Well, a couple things come to mind. One is that, we talk about these generational trauma patterns. Sometimes you'll hear people say generational curses, right? And if we want to use that language, then we also want to adopt the saying that curses don't end, they're broken.
Mm.
And so you get to be the breaker. You get to decide. God has gifted you with selective attention. God has gifted you with a mind and a brain and a nervous system that's wired for healing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's okay if it's healing, right? We always want to hurry up and get to the other side and say, healed,
Yeah,
healed, we've arrived, right? And I would say, even for myself, yes, there are many things I can say that by the grace of God and really good therapy that have healed within me. And also, I am still healing. Like that is, but I get to do that. That
Mhm.
work is, and because it is work, it's good work, sometimes hard work, but we get to do that. And it changes us into more of who we really are. It really is about just that becoming who we are. And I would say who we already are at our core. We just don't know it yet.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say if you have breath in your lungs, it is not too late.
Yep.
That is just a lie straight from the pit of hell that it's ever too late. It is never too late. If you're here, it's not too late.
Yeah.
And also, it's important to know that if this is something you suspect, that there is this generational thing, look at then how it has manifested in your life. Those are the places to really focus in, because ultimately that's what you want to change, is how it's manifesting in your life. And some of that might require working with your nervous system to learn how to calm yourself, to learn how to create a sense of safety within yourself as you do some of this exploration into more practical ways of how you live it out. And then, if it's safe to do so, have some conversations with people in your family. Ask them about the things that you suspect,
Mm-hmm.
or ask them just about their lives. Ask them to tell you their story if they're willing to tell you. Sometimes you'll know by what they choose not to tell you.
Mm-hmm.
And if the answer is as simple as, oh, I don't like to look back. I don't want to look back. We don't look back with longing, right? Like we're not looking back at that old way of life with longing. But it is good to look back with the idea that we want to learn.
Mm-hmm. Some curiosity.
And curiosity, exactly. And so, but if you come up against a brick wall, then in all likelihood, you're coming up against that brick wall because there really is something there. And you don't have to unearth it. There is no research that says we have to know every little tidbit of our story and our family's story in order to heal. There's no research that says that.
Yep.
Sometimes it can be as simple as saying, I know there are some things,
Mm-hmm.
and so I'm going to work with what I can work with here in the present moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I like what you said too, that in healing, you're kind of getting back to the core of who you are. Something that I believe very much is that trauma changes how we are. It doesn't change who we are. And we can heal the how part, when we see all these how, like people say, I hate who I am when I'm like this, and I'm mean and I'm angry and like whatever. And I like to remind them that's not who you are, that's how you are. And you are that way, you behave that way because you've been hurt, and these are reactions out of your trauma. That's how you are, and trauma changes how you are. It doesn't change who you are. So experience some healing with the how stuff and get back to the who,
Beautiful.
And yeah, so Gina, thank you so much. I'm really grateful just for you, your time here today, and grateful for your book. And if someone wants to find you, if someone wants to find your book, how do they go about doing that?
Yeah. So they can find the books on Amazon. So that's real easy. If they want to find me, they can find me at Gina@GinaBirkemeir.com. And then I'm on the socials at My Out Loud Voice.
My Out Loud Voice, yeah.
My Out Loud Voice. Uh-huh.
And so GinaBirkemeir.com.
Mm-hmm.
And just one more time, the name of your book, so I can search it on Amazon.
Sure. Generations Deep: Unmasking Inherited Dysfunction and Trauma to Rewrite Our Stories Through Faith and Therapy. And it is available in English and Spanish.
Oh, fantastic. Good. Yeah. And I'm going to put a link in the notes here on the YouTube video. So thank you so much, Gina. Very, very grateful for you.
Thanks, Bo. Grateful for you.